Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to the daily check in for June 25th, 2020. Running a little bit behind today, and that's because I was in I don't know what to call it, a webinar, a briefing, something, a presentation, but it was interactive with a company called Diamante, who wanted to let me know about some upcoming features for their new thing. And they also sent me donuts via Uber Eats. So that was epically awesome. The kids were super pumped about that. Today's topic is there is no edge. And that's because it is Thursdays and it's Thursdays on the edge. So that is the topic that I do every Thursday. If you haven't listened to previous Edge episodes, those might be helpful to give you a bit of a primer on what the Edge is and how I tend to think about it. And also, this is going to carry over some of the concepts and ideas that I introduced yesterday. So if you didn't listen to yesterday's episode, I'll try to fill in the gaps, but it would probably make more sense to go back and listen to that one. I don't have any housekeeping items today other than to say, if you have any topics or ideas for future episodes, I would really like to hear them. I've still got a great list, but I give priority to whatever people send in. And so if you have an idea, just send it to me. Twitter is Ned1313. You can hit me on LinkedIn or leave a comment in the YouTube if you don't mind broadcasting it. And I will absolutely try to get to that topic because I love the feedback. Keep it coming. Before we get into the topic of today, let's check in. How are you? How you doing? It's Thursday. Thursday's good. I had a donut today. Did you have a donut? I hope you did. Or if you don't eat donuts, well, then I hope you had something that was as satisfying as a donut, though I don't know what that thing would be. I had a sour cream donut, and those are delicious. So hopefully you're doing well. Hopefully you're taking care of yourself and you are getting pumped for the weekend. Let's talk about there is no edge. Dun dun dun. What if I told you there was no edge? I'll pack in a few Matrix references in there. Okay, so yesterday I talked about centralized versus distributed systems, and that ties well into this where we think about edge. We tend to think of things in existing terms and existing mental models of how we map the world. And because of that, that really informs how we approach new technology. We basically take what we know about original technology and we apply that to new technology. The greatest example of this is when the web first came out, people basically took the technologies they knew, things like newspapers, and then just reproduced those things exactly the same, but in digital format. So newspapers were literally just putting their newspapers online without changing or altering it or adapting to the new format in any way. But as things evolved, we all saw how new forms of media grew out of that. Another good example is, if you went back to pre-car and asked someone who had a horse and buggy what they really wanted, they might tell you a faster horse. Right. But what they really want, and I think this is attributed to Henry Ford. I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but what they would say they want is a faster horse, but what they really need is a car. And they'll never think of a car because they're thinking of things in the way that they already know. They can't wrap their mind around the new technology until you show it to them and go, oh, but you could have a car instead of a horse. Isn't that so much nicer? And, we can debate the merits of that. But the point is, as new technology evolves and rolls out, we always use our previous understanding of technology and mental models to apply to that new technology until someone has a breakthrough. Someone comes up with a killer application for it. What's the killer app for the internet? Well, I would argue that social media is probably one of the biggest killer apps for the internet. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is that some ideas can be good, but they can be introduced at the wrong time. So a good example of that is back in the .com or .boom era, you had this thing called pets.com and people heavily invested in pets.com and it grew at ridiculous rates. But the problem is the user base wasn't there yet. The technology wasn't there yet. The delivery system wasn't there yet. There were all these things that needed to be in place for an online pet store to be successful. And people like to dunk on a lot of the dot bombs of that era. But the thing is, most of those dot bombs, I won't say all, because there was obviously some terrible ideas out of the gate, but most of those dot bombs were not bad ideas. They were just good ideas that needed the right time. As things grew, as we got better bandwidth to our homes, as payment systems evolved on the internet, as more people joined the internet, it made things like pets.com more feasible. And now you have a whole bunch of online pet stores. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Now, what does this all have to do with the edge? Why am I bringing up all of this other stuff that you may already know and have thought about? Well, I think it's useful because the mental model that most people are proposing for the edge right now draws on two things. One, there's an assumption that it has to connect back to a cloud somehow. The assumption in all of the marketing and literature that I read is you're doing things at the edge so that you can then move stuff to the cloud. So if you're collecting a bunch of data at the edge, obviously you're going to manipulate that data, shrink it down and package it, and then send it up to the cloud for something else. You are, collecting sensor data, you're analyzing video, but the presumption of all of this is somehow your edge stuff goes up to the cloud. And that's not may not be the correct mental model. We've got this hub and spoke model where edge is the spoke and cloud or your data center is the hub, and everything necessarily goes back to the hub. I don't think that's the right mental model for the edge. It's this presumption that the spokes or the end of the spoke is the edge. Whereas I think what's probably more likely is that we're looking at the potential for a massively distributed node network. Something like the networks that people build. And sometimes you have stronger and weaker bonds between nodes, and that could represent the bandwidth, latency, or connectivity between two edge nodes. And sometimes you have nodes with more connections in a personal network. So think about the idea of mavens and influencers. Those are people who have an outsized number of connections. They may be weak connections, but they have an outsized number of connections. So think of that as like an internet exchange point that has an extremely large number of connections going to different things. Then you have situations where you have a number of nodes that are tightly bound together and all interconnected. So that's sort of like an edge mesh. So when we talk about the edge, you could actually say, to a certain degree, there is no edge. There's just this complicated network of nodes with different types of connectivity between them, and that connectivity can be strong or weak. And the number of connections a node has can also represent where it sits within the larger mesh of nodes. So when you think about it in that regard, and you disregard this whole hub and spoke model that you have in your mind, that opens up the mental model to new applications for the technology that we have. So it's not so much shifting what exists out there. I mean, the technology has to be built, but now you can go back and look at systems that would function better in a distributed edge mesh versus applications that function well in a hub and spoke architecture, and go, okay, we didn't have the architecture or the mental model for what was required for that application 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But we're building it out now, and we're going to have it shortly. We're going to have this massively distributed mesh of network nodes that all have a certain amount of compute and storage available to them. Can we now build that application? Is it now a viable application to build? What are these applications? What are these mystery apps that are going to appear at the edge? I have no idea. If I knew, I would be immensely rich because I would be founding a startup to push one of these applications or something. There's probably going to be something with AR, augmented reality, something that has failed multiple times and has not gained significant traction. And I think in a large part, that's because the platforms to support it have not been adequately built out. It's that whole good idea, wrong time sort of situation. So if I had to place bets, I would say it's going to be AR, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be any of the AR products that are out there today or will be introduced in the next year. I think you're looking at a 5-year timeline, but once that killer platform gets introduced, it'll be like the smartphone all over again, but in a different form factor that requires the edge or the massively distributed network mesh to support that application and platform. So that's my ideas. I hope that wasn't too esoteric, but it all grew out of a conversation that I had with somebody else yesterday, and I think it really speaks to the potential for the edge if we shift our mental models from this hub and spoke architecture to more of a distributed mesh architecture, and how can applications function in that environment. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. Tomorrow is Friday, so we're going to be talking about HashiCorp Vault. I'm going to be covering the first objective in the certification program for Vault. So if that interests you, tune in tomorrow. Until then, stay healthy.